feeling our way, feeling our way as we go. So thank you for putting up with that part of our experience in the pandemic. And I'm really pleased to welcome Anna Schoon because she contacted us a few months ago. She saw on our website that we had been focused a little bit on the EU Prize for Literature and had welcomed two authors, a Dutch woman named Marenta de Moor and a Portuguese man named David Machado to campus. They were EU Prize for Literature winners, and we featured their works and disseminated their books. And then we held community and campus events to discuss their novels. And those were fun projects. And Brett, as an undergrad, worked with us on that. And so Anna saw that we had done some work there and contacted us and was able to interview me and Brett about that. And then that's when we perceived that her work was so interesting to us. And so we invited her to give this talk, which we hope will lead us to a bigger event focused on Creative Europe, possibly a conference down the road. So thank you so much, Anna, for doing this event today and sharing your discoveries with us. And I'm going to turn it over to Brett and Eric, who are going to introduce you. And thank you for talking to them in advance of today's event.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. And so just really quickly, my name is Brett Harris, and today we're joined by Anna Schoon, as Sarah mentioned. Anna is a PhD student at the Center for British Studies at the Humboldt University of Berlin, and today she'll be talking with us about her interdisciplinary research on European literature, specifically the EU Prize for Literature. And she offers a critical perspective on European identity and kind of how the EU develops this sort of socialization process, perhaps. And I'm going to turn it over to Eric now really quick.
Yeah, so Anna comes from the German state of Saarland. She did her bachelor's at Mannheim University and her master's at Saarland University. And just a fun fact about her, one of her favorite European Union Prize for Literature books, one of the winners, is from a British author, E.B. Wilde, and the title of that is All the Birds Singing. I've just started reading it myself. It seems to be interesting. And so we're really looking forward to hearing more from you, Anna, about your work. And thank you for coming to share that with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's a great honor to talk to you today, and thanks for the kind introduction. So I try again to share my screen with you because I have a small presentation, but we could also do without. If I click on it, it says the host has deactivated participants from sharing their screens.
We're going to reactivate that. That is going to be reactivated.
Okay. Let me try if it works now. Can you see the presentation? Amazing. Great. Okay. So again, thanks so much for having me. Super excited to be here and to talk to you today. And so what I will be talking about is I will take you a little bit on my journey of researching the European Union Prize for Literature, the EUPL. And while doing that, we cover the different parts of the title of today's talk. So I first introduced the prize because I mean, you might be one of the very few people who have heard about the prize before, because most people don't know the prize. It's not very well known. So what we'll do is we'll just quickly cover basics of what is the EUPL, how it works. And I will then share with you how I couldn't make sense of it, and hence decided that I need to explore further. And then I share with you how I found the right questions to ask to better understand the EUPL. And finally, I will answer the main question of today's talk, which is, so how European is the EUPL anyway? But first of all, let's understand the EUPL a little bit better before we talk about it for the rest of the next hour and a half. So can I just quickly ask how many of you have heard about the EUPL before reading the announcement or hearing today's talk? I see a few hands. So many cameras on. Are there more shows of?
You're muted.
There we are. Any more show of hands in the room where Sarah is sitting, for example?
Only Eric.
There. Okay. Well, in which case, all those not raising their hands are in good company, because as I said, it's not a super well-known prize, but it's interesting nonetheless. So first of all, it's important to note that it's one of several prizes that are currently co-funded by the EU. There are also prizes on heritage and pop music and architecture. And the EUPL was launched in 2009 by the European Commission under the Culture Program, and it continued to be funding under Creative Europe. And the objectives of the prize, and here I prepared a little overview of the most important facts. So as you can see here, the objectives of the prize are formulated as follows, namely the aim of the European Union Prize for Literature is to put a spotlight on the creativity and diverse wealth of Europe's contemporary literature in the field of fiction, to promote the circulation of literature within Europe, and to encourage greater interest in non-national literary works. Also, then the EUPL is organized by a consortium of 3 organizations representing producers of literature at a European level, namely the Federation of European Publishers, the European and International Booksellers Federation, and the European Writers' Council. This group organizes the proceedings and also contributes 20% of the EU's budget. The remaining 80% are then covered by the Commission. And it's also interesting to note that this consortium of literary producers, let's call them, was selected based on an open call for proposals for the EU's culture program. This means that the Federation of European Publishers, the Booksellers Federation, and the European Writers' Council, they entered into this partnership and then developed a proposal for how to run the EUPL based on a basic outline that was given by the Commission in the call for proposals. Then another interesting fact is, despite the name, participation is not limited to EU member states. In total, 35 to 37 countries participate. And those countries include member states, so EU member states, but also EFTA countries, except Switzerland, as well as candidate and potential candidate countries, covering a wide range of the Eastern and Central European countries in Europe. Then the award comes with 5,000 euros for each winner, and it's addressed to emerging writers, which according to the prize criteria is defined as writers who have not published more than 2 to 4 books of fiction. And then it's also noteworthy that there is an elaborate annual award ceremony in Brussels every year, and that the EUPL is tied to EU translation funding schemes, which means that publishers applying for EU support for literary translations, they receive extra points when their packages of 3 to 10 books include EUPL winners. So they increase their chances of getting EU funding for translations if they apply with EUPL winners. And then criteria for winning the EUPL are quite broad. So the EUPL, as I said, addresses emerging authors who need to be citizens of the country awarding the EUPL to be eligible. And there are several formal criteria for winning the EUPL. For example, winning books must not be older than 18 months, and they should not have been translated too widely, which according to the prize criteria would be maximum 4 translations so far. And so far, I mean, until summer 2021, there have been 148 winners of the EUPL. That is quite a lot for a prize that's been running for somewhat more than 10 years. And the reason therefore lies in the particular structure organization of the EUPL. which I've summarized here. So here you can see the countries in the first cycle of the prize, because it's organized in this cyclical fashion. So one cycle lasting 3 years, and across those 3 years, the participating countries are divided into 3 groups. So in one group, in 1 year, the first group of countries selects one national jury. The national jury selects one national winner each, I should say. And the second year, same, third year, the same. And so after 3 years, we have a complete prize cycle, and we ended up with 35 winners, one from one country each. And we come back to that point because it's quite, yeah, it's one of the interesting features of the EUPL. So now let's talk a bit about how I came across the EUPL and how I found it's a good idea to research it. So I should say that throughout my studies, I was always interested in self and other, especially the tensions between collective and individual identities. And you don't do cultural studies without coming across that topic. And then it's also a fact that some European dimension is kind of part of who I am. I grew up in a pretty European way, in a sense. So my parents had witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1998, actually being in Berlin. But then they moved back to the province where they were born, and small place in the border region to France. We did quite a bit of traveling when I was younger, and I even attended a special European branch in school, which was focused on German-French relations and student exchange. And so there's a lot of this, open borders and open borders, being curious and open towards other countries, etc. That's you could define it as European. And so if we define European as that, that's clearly part of who I am. But I'm also a very inquisitive person. And so although I'm kind of European, I still can't relate to this very emotional focus on Europe and European identity. So this very celebratory sense of how Europeans, and we proudly wave the European flag and everything. I don't have any patriotic bone in my body. And so that doesn't work, it doesn't work for Germany, it doesn't work for Europe either. And also I did quite a bit of post-colonial theory throughout my studies, which taught me to be very, very careful about any celebratory sense of Europe or Europeanness. But at the same time, neither does the EU speak appeal to me. So, focusing on markets and, single markets and taxes and, customs. And so, that's not my jam, if you want. And so all of this left me in a position where I thought, I don't understand it. I don't understand exactly what it means to be European, or what European means in that sense. So better look into it in some more detail. And being trained in literary studies, what better way to approach a topic than from a literary angle, right? And so after all, literary discourse on Europe has been influential in developing and transmitting the original utopia of peaceful collaboration among European countries. So a utopia to which the European Union had eventually given an institutional form. And don't take that from me, there are scholars who have researched the topic extensively, such as Paul Michael Lützler, Anne Kraume, Gerhard Brunn, and many others. And so that's the point when I encountered the EUPL. I knew that European literature is a complicated topic, and I thought, why not let somebody else define it for me? And which more straightforward definition of European literature can there be than literary texts and authors given a prize by the EU? It must be European literature, right? But unsurprisingly, it quickly turned out to be way more complicated, because the EUPL is not such a straightforward phenomenon after all. And let me illustrate that based on the first part of the title and the different evaluations of the EUPL out there. So first of all, we have the official statement on the EUPL by the European Commission here, José Manuel Barroso, who said in 2014, I am now proud to see that after only 6 editions, the EUPL has become a well-established and respected tradition in European literature that serves to promote Europe's cultural and linguistic diversity, a principle very much at the heart of the European project. Well, maybe, but the EUPL is still not very well known, and there are several documents, especially evaluations of cultural programs, which show that the EUPL does actually not quite work as intended. So, for example, in terms of the way it promotes translations or it signals for publishers to actually pay attention to a word, there is data which suggests otherwise, but Barroso had to say it. He's paying for it after all. And then we have the quote by Adam Thorpe, a British writer, who said that, who in his article that I'm quoting here, he acknowledges the EUPL as a potential yet ineffective way to promote translations. But then he goes on, and here's the quote: "Perhaps when it comes to books, there is a suspicion of centralized directives that have nothing to do with the act of writing. We remember the Soviet Union's interdiction on virtually anything but the literature of its socialist republics. Although the comparison is not quite fair, we have to be ever vigilant about the centralized Politburo aspect of the EU." So according to Thorpe, the EUPL is part of the ideological work of the EU. So in normalizing an EU cultural identity which is allegedly fundamental to legitimize itself. And here he refers back to the idea of national identities and how historically nation states have legitimized themselves through this sense of continuity, through time, through invented traditions, speaking with Hobsbawm here. And so again, normalizing the nation state, or in that case, the EU, by very specific ideological works. I mean, ideological not in the sense of repressive, exploitative, brainwashing, but in the sense of just normalizing things through everyday practices. And so you stop questioning them because they're just there. And according to Thorpe, that seems to be something that the EU is doing quite blatantly, if you want. But at the same time, cultural policy research by, for example, Monica Sassatelli, Kieran Partle, and Annabelle Litus-Monet, they suggest that Thorpe's argument is actually not valid. The way the EU cultural programs are structured show that the EU knows better than striving for simple identity engineering techniques. And we come back to that point in a minute. That brings me to the second part of the title. So the EUPL as a European literary authority, which is something that Pascale Casanova said. So she, in turn, takes the prize seriously as part of a European literary field. So what does she mean by that? She offers, with the European literary field, she offers an alternative understanding of European literature. So it's not about the humanist canon of great literature, so Dante and Shakespeare and Virginia Woolf, which they tend to quote, so they have one woman in there. And so that's not what she means. So instead she draws on Pierre Bourdieu and her own research on the World Republic of Letters, and argues that literature is constituted in the actions and interactions between literary agents negotiating literary value. So what this means is that literary value is not inherent in a text, but it's socially constructed in this public conversation about books. So Bourdieu calls it the belief in a work of art, which is then created in this social interaction, in this literary field. And while most national literary fields are well established because of long historical developments, such a European literary field is still in the making, as Casanova puts it. And she argues that, and here's the quote, the European literary world can be regarded as a space in the making, indicated by the fact, among others, that there are still few specific literary authorities, very few publishers, writers, literary award juries, save those that result from political and institutional instigation or funding, that claim as their sole identity the fact of belonging to Europe. So Casanova then speculates that the EUPL can be such an occasion where agents in the field come together to negotiate literary value on European literature. But the EUPL's role in this still, is to be determined, especially because of the EUPL's political ties, not a primarily literary effort. Now, with all the different voices on the EUPL, what to make of it? I think we can safely exclude the European Commission's evaluation on their own price. Yet, what about the other two? How does the EUPL sit between EU top-down identity engineering and contributing to constituting a 21st century version of European literature? And to answer this question, I found that I need to answer another question first, and here I'm taking you back on my journey of researching the EUPL, namely the question of how exactly does the EUPL work and what exactly is European about it? And is it the way it is organized? Is it the agents involved in the prize? Is it the winning text or authors? I didn't know. So why is it important to ask this question then? Well, and you need to understand how exactly it works and how exactly it sits in the overall EU cultural policy framework. And also, which kind of literature does it promote? Is there some ideological work going on here, which authors and texts receive the text? You just need to look, you basically need to look behind the facade you see online or in the, at the award ceremony in Brussels, what is actually going on, what's happening here. And I suspect there might be an interesting difference to the US or transatlantic perspective, because I suppose from the outside, it would be relatively easy to say, well, clearly that's European. Why not? It's in Europe, there are European people involved, so clearly the EU is involved, so what's not European about it? But from within, it feels way more complicated. And I would be more than happy to pick up this point in the discussion at the end. So any thoughts and ideas you would like to share on that? Very eager to hear that. And now we're moving towards the final part of this talk, namely the answering the overall question. So how European is the EUPL after all? And as a little refresher, I go back to the slide with the most important facts about the EUPL. And the way the EUPL presents itself and the way we have encountered it so far, it seems that there is not so many points that speak for the interpretation of the EUPL as an ideological tool, because it mainly addresses the production of literature. And especially the objectives and the criteria do not force any special content or representation of Europe or the EU. So we can go back to the objectives. The aim of the EUPL is to put the spotlight on creativity and diverse wealth of Europe's contemporary literature in the field of fiction, promote circulation of literature within Europe, and encourage greater interest in non-national literary works. It also, in combination with the criteria, addresses emerging authors who need to be citizens of the country awarding the prize, and formal criteria, books not older than 18 months, not translated too many times. It doesn't say you need to provide a special vision of Europe, you need to, authors don't need to have a specific European background in any sense, so, no biographical criteria or anything. So that's pretty much, that's a matter of fact thing. So not too much ideological stuff going on here. And then we have the tendering system I mentioned earlier, which plays a crucial role in this aspect. So the EUPL is based on the concrete ideas of literary agents, who, by the way, have also been involved in developing the EU cultural programs with their public policy activities in Brussels and beyond. And I've prepared this graph to illustrate this one a little bit. So the parts you can see in blue are the EU institutions. In yellow, we have the literary field represented by the writers, booksellers, and publishers. And in green, because it's a mix, we have the areas where those two areas actually overlap. And going through this graph really quickly is we have the producers of literature who provide input and consult EU institutions for when they develop their cultural programs. They're always public consultations, and the booksellers, publishers, writers, etc. They hold public panel debates, for example, in Brussels, making sure they stay in touch with the legislators, with the MEPs, and with people you need to know. So there's lots of formal and informal conversation going on, which then leads into arrow 2, the development of the cultural program. So be it Creative Europe or the culture program back in the days. Now, based on the program, the European Commission publishes a call for proposals in which they lay out some basic guidelines of what they want, like budget, timeline, which reports do they want, which communication products do they want, and also some baseline for what they want in the price. So, for example, in the call for proposals, for example, they said we want a price that awards, that is awarded to as many people from different countries as possible. That's what that was given. But then it was the consortium, this partnership of the 3 organizations that said, oh yeah, let's come up with the cycle structure and with the different groups and with this national organization, etc. So there is a certain agency here for the literary agents too. So the European Commission publishes the call for proposals. The literary field, the literary representatives respond to the call for proposals, which is in turn evaluated by the European Commission, and more exactly the executive agency responsible for culture and education that supports the European Commission actually implementing all the programs. And so this agency then, or the European Commission, to simplify things, then accepts the tender and or the proposal, and then commissions the consortium to actually implement the price. So as you can see, EU policy making is complex in that way, and there's so many, there's so much overlap and so much interplay that's going on that it would be just too reductive to say, oh yeah, that's top-down identity engineering. It's not like the EU hadn't gone down the path of hadn't drawn on some national techniques as well. I mean, the EU has a flag and an anthem, and especially in the early days, there has been a stronger focus in that respect. But right now, I mean, it's a living institution, it's learning, and so this is how cultural programs are made and implemented at the moment. And so, considering these points, the EUPL then suggests that the question to the answer, how European is the EUPL, does not lie in specific characteristics of the prize, but instead what it does, namely enable a literary conversation about the referent European literature a literary conversation about referent European literature. And it's in this conversation in which literary agents participate voluntarily and to mutual benefit. The EUPL, for example, has also been relevant in EU external relations. so EUPL winners actually going to Japan for a literary festival, meaning they had a funded trip to Japan. They could stay a week, they could represent themselves, but also the EU. And at the same time, the EU benefits from that public display of cultural richness and wealth. And so it's this mutual benefit in which literary agents participate voluntarily that I would like to stress, and that I find really important. And because of that, I think we can understand the EUPL as a matter of Europeanization, which I define with Ulrich Beck and Edgar Grant as a regional concept of what is generally called transnationalization, one tailored to the peculiarities of the European Union, unquote. So it's this process. It's a process of transnationalization, of bringing people together, of enabling exchange, of creating mobility for artists and writers, instead of disseminating given content on what the EU is or what it should be, etc. Now, however, this pragmatic understanding of the EUPL in European literature has its limits. Because after all, there are quite a few ideological aspects of the EUPL. And so first of all, the EUPL is part of a cultural policy program, which are inherently ideological to begin with. And here I'm quoting Monica Sassatelli, who says that one of the aims of cultural policy has always been the fostering of specific identities and thus the formatting of a fully socialized, compliant citizen. It's just in the nature of what cultural policy does. It's not about autonomous art. It's about using art for certain purposes. It's just in the nature of the thing. Then we also have the name of the prize. So the name of the prize is geared toward making the EUPL particularly visible in order to legitimize it in the realm of culture, of literature more specifically. Then we have the specific use of literary instruments like anthologies and the literary prize itself, because both are used to display some EU glamour and institutional discourse, for example, in the annual award, in the annual anthologies, but also during the award ceremonies. And feel free to consult the website. There are also videos of the award ceremonies online that you can have a look at. And then I think it becomes quite clear what I mean with that. So it involves lots of shaking hands with representatives from the European Commission and lots of warm words about all sorts of things. And then finally, coming back to the organization of the prize, remember the cycle with 3 years and lots of winners. The organization of the prize eclipses the fundamental principle of competition, which is a main part of giving a prize. So the EUPL basically comes down to what Carol Lewis in Alice in Wonderland called something like, everybody has won and all must have prizes. Good. And finally, the organization is again a display of the harmonious coexistence of countries, which often does not reflect what's actually going on in Europe. And paradoxically, this European prize actually reinforces divisions by national lines in a very un-European way. So by having this national organization, you have authors necessarily tied to the country very, very specifically, even though, I mean, for years now, writers were not very keen on being associated with just one country or representing one country. It's, but still the prize does it. Now, I discuss all of these points in more detail in my thesis, and I think these are important points. Yet the value assumptions underlying this more critical evaluation of the EUPL needs to be challenged as well. Otherwise, we wouldn't have needed to start this talk after Thorpe's quote on EU and European literature. But we can pick this up in the round of questions if you like. Now, what we haven't talked about are the authors winning the EUPL. So which outlook on the EUPL do they support? I'm happy to discuss this in more detail in the round of questions as well, especially based on your experience with the writers who participated in the EUPL event held here. But after just a few words, and then I've talked for long enough, I'd say. Here's a list of the EUPL winners in the 3 countries, which I used as case studies in my thesis, namely the UK, Ireland, and Germany. So for the UK, we have Adam Thorpe, The Quickening Maze. We have E.V. Wild, All the Birds Singing, the novel that Eric started reading, which I'm really thrilled to hear. And we have Sanjeev Sahuta's The Year of the Runaways. For Ireland, we have Karen Gillies, Longshore Drift, Kevin Berry, City of Bohan, Donald Ryan, The Spinning Heart. And finally, for Germany, we have Iris Hanika, Das Eigentliche, Maritza Botrocic, Kirschholz und alte Gefühle, and Benedikt Welz, Vom Ende der Einsamkeit. Now, except Karen Gillies, her, and Benedikt Welz, him, we can talk about them later again, all authors conform to a traditional understanding of legitimate literature as put forward by Pierre Bourdieu, for example. Oops, sorry. There we are. Now the winning authors, they tick all the boxes. They were widely received, so either nationally or internationally, even in major news outlets, which is important. There was a lot of academic and essayistic reception. They received prizes and awards and grants. So either they won them or they were nominated for them. There were translations, there were given residencies in certain places. So all the factors which need to be fulfilled to suggest recognition by an audience of professional readers who value aesthetic and formal criteria over content and commercial success. Also in Ireland and UK, no books reception is marked by explicit references to Europe, showing that there is no tendency for the juries to select works for their European content. In Germany, slightly different. So Hanika and Botrocic, they're kind of leaning slightly more into this direction, because Hanika writes about Holocaust commemoration, and Maritza Botrocic writes a very transnational story about a young woman who's lived in very many different places and has a background from the former Yugoslavia, and so kind of European themes woven into that. But the jury reports do not celebrate Hanika or Botrocic's seemingly European content anyway. They adopt a completely different reasoning. So in conclusion, the EUPL consecrates predominantly legitimate literature, so it does not impose any ideological dimension on the selection of the winners, as far as my case studies suggest. Now, this brings me to the end of this part of the event. We have gotten to know the EUPL and discussed its reception and what we need to explore in more detail to be able to evaluate it properly. And for this purpose, we answered the question, how European is the EUPL? Finding that the notion of Europeanization is a suitable way to describe the EUPL. And despite some of the ideological features, which one needs to acknowledge, so not to end up with the EC's, with the European Commission's celebratory discourse on its own initiatives, the EUPL has the potential to actually be something interesting in the field. Potentially, it can be part of the European literary field in the making, but time will tell, because those are long-term processes. And after 10 years, the EUPL can't claim that role in any way. And now I'm very happy to pick up any points which we could just quickly touch upon earlier, to answer any questions, and importantly, hear your thoughts and ideas about Europe the EU, the EUPL, European literature, and European identity. Yeah. Thanks so much.
There is applause in the room, just so you know about it.
Thanks for the translation.
Thank you so much for coming and chatting again. It's always wonderful to hear all about this. One thing that I was curious about, I hadn't realized this before, but non-EU member states are able to participate in the prize. Like I saw Turkey on the list. And so I was kind of wondering, do you think the sort of dynamics of this prize and its reception are the same kind of in these non-EU member states? Like, do they have the same stake kind of in participating as maybe say like, Germany or the UK? Well, the UK when it was still in the EU.
I mean, that's a really interesting question, and that's also a gap in my research that has bothered me throughout. There's some evidence that it is indeed different in other countries, in non-EU, or at least either in non-EU member states or in countries that joined more recently than others. So, for example, there's one winner from Latvia who explains in one of her interviews that she has actually become a sought-after literary writer who's also invited to judge and give out other prizes as a reaction to her being associated with the EU and this European prize. And I think there's another writer from Montenegro who said something similar. And the evidence I have for that is based on some videos of panel debates at literary festivals or book fairs, which were recorded, which were then available online. But is clearly something that needs to be looked into in more detail. So my research is really just a conversation starter, and I'm aware that the result might look quite different in other countries.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Welcome. Nia wrote, I have a question. Please, Nia, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Awesome. So I loved your presentation. Thank you so much for talking to us about this and talking about sort of the ideological basis for it, because I think that's really interesting. My first question is kind of related to the last one, which is like, has anyone or have any books been submitted or considered that are totally outside of the geographical area that we normally talk about as Europe, like a Syrian author or someone from, the US or Japan? Like, has that ever even entered the conversation? And then second, could you like briefly reflect on how similar or different you think the EUPL is to something like the Eurovision Song Contest?
I love both your questions. So about the first one, there are authors who have won the prize who have some sort of mixed background. So for example, one of the winners from the Netherlands, he's, I think, of Iraqi descent, but he's still a citizen of the Netherlands. And that's that. Or there's a Czech writer who's got a Congolese father and a Czech mother, and that's about as exotic as it gets. It also shows in the books a little bit, because books that are, and here I'm referring to all of the books, not just the one I consulted, based on my reading the blurbs and the jury reports. And there are very, very few books that are set anywhere else but in European countries. There is one or so that is set in China. E.B. Wild's All the Birds Singing is both set in the UK and in Australia. But again, handful of more examples, but nothing substantial. And it's also a thing, the prize hasn't published any shortlists, for example, until very recently. So it's very hard to tell which other books had entered the competition, because again, the overall communication of the prize was not very prominent until recently. But there's one jury report from Ireland where they actually say which books they had shortlisted. It was a shortlist of 5 books, 3 times, was it Kevin Barry? And 2 more. That's not the most interesting one. No, in the year that Donald Ryan won, who was shortlisted along with one author who's, I think, has got an American background and kind of writes about Europe from the outside. So with this outsider's perspective. But that one did not win the prize, but the one which is very specifically about Ireland. The other book on the shortlist was by Miss Campbell, writing about Wall Street and the crash, etc. But also that one did not win the book, although you could construct a very Irish narrative out of that. But I would even go as far as to say that the perspective on the respective national context is something that is promoted in the prize based on the selection of the books. And so, yeah, it was not very transparent who entered, who, I don't know, also rejected the prize, could potentially be, who was shortlisted, hard to tell, but there are some pieces of evidence I could share here. For the second question, how is it different from the European Eurovision Song Contest? First of all, I'm going to say it's kind of a guilty pleasure. I don't watch it actively, but afterwards I spend some time on YouTube and listen to the songs, because often they're really there are real gems in there. The EUPL is different because it's funded by the EU. Eurovision Song Contest is not. Eurovision Song Contest is funded by different media stations, media outlets, and so it's more of a commercial, popular entertainment event, and it, strictly speaking, has nothing to do with the EU. I'm not 100% sure, but I would even doubt the EU is funding it in any way. If so, indirectly, by potentially providing funding to one of the media outlets that are organizing it. But I mean, of course, there are similarities. Is Australia still participating in the Eurovision? The EUPL doesn't go that far, but still quite far. I think in the last round, they also had Tunisia joining. And so, yeah, there are similarities, but yeah, but also quite a few differences. And also, I think the Eurovision Song Contest is somewhat more entertaining than than the EUPL at times. There's one more thing in the chat.
Thank you.
Most welcome. One of the targets of the EUPL is the promotion of diverse creativity. How diverse has the prize awarding been so far, according to your analysis? Well, diverse in terms of author background, not very much, no. Again, there are a handful of authors who have some sort of mixed background, but then often not even a minority background. So Evie Wilde, for example, she's British Australian, but that I wouldn't count that as particularly diverse. Also, in my analysis of the juries, I found that they're not particularly diverse in terms of age and also cultural background, for example. I think in the third year, in 2017, in the UK, there was one literary critic with, it might be an Indian, of the Indian descent, and she was the first non-white person taking part in there. And in terms of other forms of diversity. In a very banal way, the books are different. The authors are different. It's many countries that participate, so it's this very shallow understanding of diversity. So in that respect, they are, but in any more challenging sense of diversity, I mean, even with the linguistic diversity, for example, they say they promote linguistic diversity, but at the same time, they still perpetuate the dominance of English also in European conversations, because it just has become the lingua franca for all sorts of conversations. So the prize website is in English, for example. The annual anthologies are mostly published in English, and there's little alternative to that. There's some French, but mostly not. Also in the annual anthologies, there are snippets of the book that are reprinted in the original language, but then they're also translated either into English or French. And I think there's only some of the English speaking, English language texts that are actually translated into French. Otherwise, English clearly dominates. The EUPL's organization. And also in terms of linguistic diversity, I alluded to it with the translation, promoting translations into all sorts of languages isn't quite work the way it was intended, because the licenses sold for the EUPL winners mostly are for Eastern European countries, for example. A lot of Serbian language, especially Serbian, Hungarian. So countries that would not need any more influx of translations from the English language, which is already dominating the book markets anyway. And so that hasn't worked out. And there are even some evaluation reports which support that point. And also the other way around, having books from less widely used languages translated into English to then make them accessible to a broader audience, that has also not worked very well, because being translated into English, it takes quite a bit of prestige, and there's quite a threshold. Iris Hanika is on the verge of being translated into English, and Benedict Wells has already published an English translation. But that's also because of his slightly different status, whereas Iris Hanika and Morica Botrocic are highly literary writers. Benedict Wells is more following this model of Anglophone literary fiction, so being somewhere in between literary quality and just being very accessible. So this is a highly emotional book, and I wonder if somebody exists on this planet who can read it without actually crying his or her heart out. And so he's different in that respect. Also, he addresses a younger audience. So yeah, he's slightly more audience oriented than his fellow winners from Germany. So yeah, diversity, though, in terms of people of color, something, not so much linguistic diversity. They're trying, but it's not working out always. Thanks.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
I'm in the room with Sarah. So I apologize if I missed this during the presentation, but do the authors submit the book before the jury decides, or does the jury kind of have an idea of the pool that they're going to take from? That's my first question. And then the second question is, based off of who has won in the past, have the authors kind of, I assume they give some statement after they win. Have they expressed, or have most of them expressed kind of like a pro-European sentiment when they win, or has there been winners who have been maybe less favorable towards European integration, or what have you seen from the pool of winners?
Yeah, thanks for these questions too. Who proposes the novels? It's actually the juries themselves who come up with the shortlist and then just select from that shortlist. It's not, there are prizes where publishers can submit, publishers or authors can submit actively, but here it's, again, the jury deciding what they want to do, which is, it has this notion of, it's kind of arbitrary, but at the same time, the jury tends to be composed of, or the juries tend to be composed of people from the respective book markets. So it's also booksellers and publishers and other writers. And so they kind of know their stuff. And in most cases, I mean, it's prizes for emerging writers. And in most cases, they kind of predicted that writers would be, or would continue to be successful. I could elaborate on Karen Jalise here, because she's an interesting case. So Karen Jalise, for example, she's one of the odd one outs I haven't discussed earlier, because when she received the prize, it was in the first year of the first edition of the EUPL. And so her book is also, again, it's this Anglophone literary fiction. It's okay aesthetically, but it's also pretty, emotional in a sense, very emotionally appealing to your emotions. And it was her fourth book, her fourth novel. And it was, this is kind of she said it herself that she was at the verge of, becoming this kind of chiplet writer. And the jury report said they selected her because of her technical mastery and because they see that she's on the verge of becoming a writer of some renown. She did, but in a completely different way than the others or anticipated, because she took a long break of not writing anything at all. And then she came back with a co-writing project with Paul Perry, and she started writing thrillers. So really best-selling thrillers, one after the other. And she's commercially successful. In a recent review, she was in The Guardian, she was quoted as one of the most successful writers of crime fiction. And there were books and series, there were films and series based on her works. So she continued to be successful, but in a very, very commercial way, and not in this literary fashion that the jury might have expected. So they were kind of right, but in a completely different way. So much for the juries, and apologies for the little excursion here. And the second question is about the European sentiments expressed by the writers. I mean, it was mostly positive. There were a few writers who said, I'm surprised I got the prize because I had never heard of it before. But overall, they were making an effort to be positive about it. I think the most explicit rejection I have witnessed, I'm not saying there aren't others, but what Kevin Barry, he's quite a character, you would say. I think he's a very, very interesting public figure. And when being asked if he was a European writer more than an Irish writer, so he evades the question saying, oh, well, I'm not sitting down writing, like, today I write some Irish fiction, or today I sit down and write some European fiction. So he just writes, and if it happens to speak to some European subject, it's fine, but not particularly. And then Benedict Wells, for example, and he even makes, he quite proactively expresses his support for the European Union, especially because it was at the time of the refugee crisis, as they called it, where people were actually drowning in the Mediterranean. And so in that context, Benedict Wells made it clear that he's a fan of the EU, and that it's important that countries work together and make sure that we don't forget about other people along those lines. but there was no scandal along the lines of, you know, some EU bashing at the award ceremony or something. That, you know, the prize, I think, is not designed for scandal. And even though some scandal would do it quite good, quite a cynical thing to say, but in terms of the attention economy, scandals can actually help to bring something to attention. And so a nice juicy scandal could actually be a nice way of bringing the prize forward, and also maybe waking up the organizers a little bit, and, you know, for some more changes, or who knows, maybe in the years to come. But so far, nobody stood up and said, you know, I'd rather do Brexit all over again or so.
All right, thank you.
You're most welcome.
I think your talk is so interesting, and I really love how you talked about sort of your own personal story and how you came to this topic, and then also how you can understand the prize winners and the texts themselves as being European if you look at the function of the prize. If you go into the texts themselves, you may looking for what is Europe, you may not find it, but if you look at the function of the prize, look at the externals, then you might get an interesting answer. And I really appreciate that way of looking at it. And when I thought about focusing on this at the center and bringing authors to us, which of course we've only had 2, but I felt like it was European in the sense that I couldn't get easy access to those books, not very many, right? Just easily on Amazon or in our library. And then I thought, oh, because like the American market is not interesting, you know, I thought this was a money-making in part initiative, and why are these books not being marketed to us? And so that's when I felt sort of on the outside. And then with the authors themselves, you know, we would quiz them, well, how does this make you feel to be basically a representative of the EU, or your book is, and how did it make you feel to win it? And you know, both of them were so self-effacing. Like I have no idea why I won. I don't have any answers. They were like, we brought you across the Atlantic to answer these questions about European Union identity and your text, and you have no answers. And it's just really interesting too to see how when they got to that 10th anniversary of the prize, and they invited the authors to, all the winners, to write a short story essentially focused on the EU and Europe, they sort of flipped it, right? So but then those authors got the chance to deliberately write something meeting this criteria, which I think is interesting. And so it just, everything, the way you said that it cycles, you know, with who's able to be considered from what countries at a time. But then within the rhetoric of the prize, the definition is to promote greater interest in non-national literature. So it's defined by a negative. And then the first thing we do is talk about, we brought a Dutch author here, we brought a Portuguese, you know, we go right to the nationality. So I think that's really fascinating as well, what it brings out when we just delve into these questions, and there might not be specific answers, but it's such a, it's an interesting way in to some of the debates that I think are valuable. But then I'm really appreciative too that you're critical of it, because it troubles me in the sense that you have to be a citizen of one of the EU countries, or at least a participating country in Creative Europe. Some are not EU member states, because of course there are a lot of people living in Europe who don't have that one of those passports, so they're excluded. And then the other thing that troubles me is that why is it called the EU Prize for Literature when really it's the EU Prize for Novel or Narrative? I guess there's some short stories. I mean, I don't think there's any drama. I don't think there's any poetry, right?
No.
So that seems prescriptive too, and I get worried that it's defining what literature is, but it's marginalizing, you know, not only some of the writers, but some of the genres.
Yeah, I mean, interesting points, and I think especially the negative part about non-national That's a very interesting angle. Thanks for sharing that.
And if you go back to the roots of Comp Lit, I mean, we were studying national literatures, right? That's the essence of the beginning of the discipline. So now to be told we're supposed to look for non-national literature, but it can be European. It's okay if it's regional, but it's not okay if it's national. That's so interesting to me.
Yeah, especially because the EU has this issue of it kind of wants to be different from the national model, but at the same time, it can't really escape what it does. And so, yeah, I mean, exactly what you said, non-national, but European is okay, even though it's not clear how exactly that should be different from this national level.
Yeah, and all the intricacies of the rules, just mirroring what the EU is known for is this bureaucratic, tangle of like a labyrinth from Borges is hilarious to me. It mocks itself in a way.
In a way, yeah. But about we might have talked about it before, but they changed in the last edition of the prize, they changed the criterion about the nationality of the author.
Oh, okay.
So they changed it to needs to be, can't remember the exact wording, but it was I will need to look it up, but it's no longer this argument of citizenship. Okay. And to be honest, they started in the year before they had changed the rules. They had already subverted that line of argument in Ireland by awarding the prize to a Northern Irish writer. So, and that was, I think, was it 2019? Should be. So it was the year before Brexit. And so actually that was a pretty, was a statement as the Republic of Ireland, as EU member state, awarding the prize to Northern Ireland, technically the UK, or no, well, the UK, and then still giving the prize out to a Northern Irish writer. It wasn't discussed at all, but I find it pretty subversive. But again, that might be, for the next research project, actually going talking to the juries and see what they think about it. Because that's for example a conversation I really would like to have, how they could do that, because it has a potential for scandal somehow in several ways, but yeah, it didn't create any, unfortunately.
Are there any other questions?
I actually have a second one, if you all don't mind. So when you were working, it was really helpful to kind of get the chart of how the prizes, decided and awarded and everything. And so one thing I'm curious about, and you kind of, I think, Sarah, you were just kind of mentioning this on, defining what literature is, but also Anna, in kind of, I don't know, how this socialization is really important. And so I'm kind of wondering, it seems to me that the prize is almost really just more about almost like Europeanizing the literati or the literary industry, and just having such frequent socialization with them in this kind of context. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the potentials of the prize, because it doesn't particularly work on this literary, on the literary level of promoting translation the way it was intended, or of promoting especially translations, and also just making people aware of the prize that did not work. So, but at the same time, that makes me come back to the argument about how the literary agents are actually involved in running the prize. So I think there must be something to it, and it's not that they don't like it or they don't appreciate it. Again, this writer from Latvia who said, now I'm invited for all sorts of events. And Adam Thorpe, for example, who's quite a pretty literary writer, has also published poetry, for example. And yeah, he's quite the academic type almost. So after having won the prize in 2009, 10, 11, 10, he stayed on jury for 2 years. So he was a jury member in the second and the third cycle, and he participated in the short story competitions that I mentioned earlier. So if a legitimate writer like Fowles takes part in that and in the same way legitimizes this prize, I think that is at least some signal to take it seriously in one way or the other, because apparently there's something to it. And I think for a more, yeah, I'm careful to draw any big conclusions here, because I've only looked at 3 countries, and I'm pretty sure it works quite differently in others. Yeah, I think one of the key benefits is actually that kind of networking, that kind of mobility that the EU promotes, and that's also in line with the priorities they're formulated in their Creative Europe programs, for example. And again, another example of Adam Thorpe and mobility, I mentioned the literature festival in Japan, where he could, spend a week in Okinawa. He participated in the festival, spent a week in Okinawa. The prize organizers, or at least the festival organizers, they made a 20-minute documentary about him and 3 other writers who were there with him. And so again, additional exposure. And then after a year later, they even published a collection of little writings about their stay in Okinawa. So lots of opportunities. And to assess that kind of impact, you would have to conduct a different study. That is something that my research only hints at. And I think it's a perspective one needs to take seriously. But to look at that from a more empirical, sociological perspective, look at something for your master's thesis. Go ahead. There's loads of interesting questions open about the EUPL.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all this interesting insight into the prize today, Anna, and for meeting with us and talking to Brett and Eric earlier in the week. And we definitely want to stay in touch and start organizing a future event with you.
Amazing. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. So if anybody, in the let me see. Here's also an email address if anybody would like to reach out in any way, sharing some more insights on, the American view on what's going on in Europe in terms of literature or not, and how weird it is for you that somebody would question the Europeanness of something so apparently European as the European Union Prize for Literature. Yeah, that's a, yeah, if anybody would like to share any insights on that, be more than happy to be on the receiving side of that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for your questions. And I stop sharing my screen now. Here we go. And yeah, thanks so much.
Wonderful. Have a wonderful weekend.
And you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Hi, everyone.